in this virtual session. Welcome all to the presentation of this magazine about Review for Peace, which is entitled Reorienting Security from Feminism. My name is Kristian Herbolzheimer. I'm the director of the Catalonian International Institute for Peace, a public institution, an independent institution with a mandate for promoting the culture of peace in Catalonian society internationally. Let me introduce briefly the review before giving the floor to the five authors who are here with us today. From the point of view of ICIP, we are alarmed by the fact that right now there are deaths in non-war contexts more than in war times. Let me explain. Last year, more people died in Mexico than in the most violent armed conflict in the world, in Afghanistan. The answer to complex problems, violent with multiple dimensions, is complex indeed. And normally they are based on police responses and repression. We believe that the complexity of these challenges implies more sophisticated answers that should be more based on human right values as opposed to the defense of the security of states. Therefore, we believe, together with many other social and institutional actors in the world, that we need new analytical frameworks and we need new practical tools. We need more conversations between theory, practice, and public policy. And this is precisely the goal of this session, in which we have actually got together authors who are leading in the conceptual and practical innovation linked to security alternative options, in this case, from a feminist perspective. Feminism is fashionable, feminism is in many people's mouths, and feminism requires, in our opinion, a space to be able to analyze in depth what we want to do. And with this review and with this introductory session. So we have in this session 5 of the 7 authors that we have invited. They are all authors from different geographic contexts and from different academic and practical and professional perspectives. And we're very happy to have the possibility of getting together in this session such different voices with this same commonly shared goal. In order to finish this short introduction, I just wanted to remind you that this session is being recorded, and after the session, there will be a graphic feminist um, storytelling or presentation. The session will be both in English and in Spanish. People who are listening to us have the choice. You can choose the language you want to listen the session in. And finally, we invite you to participate in the chat, either in Spanish or in English. So, with this short introduction, I'm going to give the floor now to the different authors so that they themselves introduce themselves, so that they give us a first view about their personal link with the different issues related to security. I'm going to give the floor to start to Nora Miralles. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be part of this very interesting edition of Peace. I'm Nora Miralles. I'm a journalist, and for 30 years I've been a researcher in gender, human rights, and security within the Studies for Peace and I am the chairwoman of Studies for Peace since December, and the Observatory of Human Rights and Peace. And on the other hand, I'm interested in conflict and security because my family comes from a conflict, although some say it's not a conflict, like the Basque Country. And for 2 years, I'm a militant of the feminist movement. So it is a cause that I'm not only interested in theoretically, but also from a practical point point of view. Unfortunately, we can't hear her. Her image has disappeared. We apologize for that. Somebody should tell her. Her connection is not good enough. Well, it looks like Nora is having some connection problems. So we will give the floor then to Ana Velasco, who is with us from Mexico. Ready. Good morning.
Gender Violence and Conflict from the University of Sussex, and another in international law from the Universidad de Granada in Spain. My undergrad was on international relations at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, also known as ITAM. And to respond to this very interesting question about how did we arrive to security and feminism, well, in my case, having studied my undergrad while the so-called war on drugs was launched in Mexico, I was very influenced by it. And since then, I knew I wanted to work on security issues. And while I was sort of interested in feminism, I honestly did not call myself a feminist, and even less thought of the two worlds together. For me, security was a distinct sphere from feminism. And I would even say that I disregarded thinking about it because I thought I wouldn't be taken seriously, right? And those were like soft issues and not the real thing. And then I realized that those were indeed very gendered perceptions and normalized in a male dominated field with very androcentric understandings of security. And well, eventually I got there, right? And well, last summer I won the international essay contest, 1325 and beyond. And currently I am a fellow at Women in International Security. I am also part of an academic seminar with another women researchers challenging precisely these dominant perspectives in the study of violence in Mexico. And well, the next month, COVID allowing, I'll be starting my PhD research in Brazil at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. And then if everything goes well, I shall be returning to the UK to continue it. Yeah, that'll be a little bit of my background.
Sorry, I'm afraid I may have been on mute. So, Swati, I'm handing over the word to you.
Great. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Sandra and colleagues at ICIP, for actually organizing this event and also for the launch of the journal in a way with all our articles, something that we'll talk about in a bit. I'm really looking forward to this interaction for several reasons, but most of all because I'm connecting with several new colleagues and with, of course, the Catalan Institute for Peace. And it is not very often that we share spaces with new colleagues outside our very familiar networks and comfort zones. And in some ways, we are not challenged enough with different ideas and thoughts. So in that sense, this is very exciting. And greetings to everyone who has joined us at all odd hours of the day, I imagine, from different parts of the world. My name is Swati Parashar, and I'm originally from India. I am an associate professor at the School of Global Studies at Gothenburg University in Sweden. My formal training is in feminist international relations and security studies, but the state of international relations and the nature of debates within have always inspired me to reject disciplinary boundaries. So, I just don't want to be an IR person. In true spirit, feminist spirit, I guess you could argue that challenging given wisdom and frameworks of the discipline has been very critical to my journey. And I now work in a very interdisciplinary space. As I've always held, you cannot study feminism and leave it there in the readings and assignments and textbooks. When you study feminism, you do feminism, you live it in your everyday life. It is something that becomes part of your body, not just because you experience the violence and exclusions of the world, and one could say in very visceral ways, but also because you're invested in reimagining a different world. I have been associated with both mainstream security through my work with think tanks, which was prior to my PhD education, which is more than a decade ago now. And since my PhD, I have been focused on feminist and post-colonial security studies. My entry point into security is through studying political violence. I started studying women combatants to start with, which to me occurs through, when we understand political violence, through acts of war. And as I now research, even through mass starvation and hunger crimes against populations that we hardly talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But to me, the idea of security is to talk about violence, to talk about the fragility, the vulnerability, the historical continuities, the location. Violence also has transformatory potential, to think about the moral, the ethical dilemmas, the injuries, all of that, to think about its coloniality, its discursive absences and silences. So to me, all of those questions about violence are fundamentally linked to security and insecurity. And I'll leave it there and we'll come back again. Thank you again, Kristian.
Thank you, Swati. Looking forward to further developing your fascinating arguments. Carme, te paso la palabra para que te presentes.
Carme, you have the floor. Thank you very much indeed, Kristian. Thank you all.
I will switch into English first to say to my colleagues in this panel how honored I am also to be part of this number of the Parlapau, the magazine Parlapau, and also to be sharing this afternoon this panel with you. Yo me llamo Carme Colomina, soy periodista también de background.
My name is Carme Colomina. I'm a journalist like Nora Miralles. I'm also a researcher at CIDOB, the Barcelona Center for International Relations, where I carry out research about the European Union information and global policies. I've worked for a long time as a journalist, and as a journalist, I've covered conflicts in different parts of the world and in many international arenas. I'm also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Belgium, and I also keep on having a weekly collaboration with the media. I work in a newspaper called Ara in Catalonia. And this is my CV somehow. The hardest part for me is to answer the second part of the presentation that Kristian required from us, i.e. what's our relationship with security and feminism. Because I have not been trained academically like most of you in security or feminism. To me, the discussion about security has been experienced firsthand on the field, as opposed to trying to analyze and explain what was happening. And feminism, well, I feel it is an inherent part of the gaze. My own personal gaze is a feminist gaze. It is an inherent part of me, and therefore it is also part of my articles. And especially since I have the honor of being part of the board of directors of ICIP. Now I feel I'm contributing in a much more specific way and in a much more direct way to these trying to promote the culture of peace. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Carme. And finally,
we hand over the word to you, Samantha. I understand you're joining us from South Africa.
Great, thank you so much, Kristian, and really lovely to hear from everyone else on the panel. Like Carme, I'm not an academic. I am currently the founder and director of an African Women's Alliance called WoMin. We work specifically on the extractives terrain, mining, oil and gas projects, as well as big infrastructure like coal-fired power stations, ports and harbors, not really working on gas pipelines. And so we started building WoMin in 2012, launched in 2013, and now in 2021, I guess we're 9 years old, we're still growing, but our focus of work is on the extractive sector, working with women affected by mining, oil and gas extraction and big infrastructure. We work with women in communities in 13 countries across the region, including West, East and Southern Africa. And we currently have a team of 17, which given the scale of the Africa region is quite insufficient. So I'm very happy to be here today. And the really entry point from WoMin's work is around our work on extractivism, which we see as a model of development organized around the large scale extraction of natural resources. And in relation to that, it was very clear from 2013 that violence and violence against women specifically was at the very heart of this model of development. And so we really spent 9 years working on a number of fronts, including examining and making visible the link between extractivism, militarization, and violence against women. So I'll explore more deeply later what that looks like and the type of work we've been doing and the way that we've been theorizing the relationship between these different elements. So that's really a bit of a background to me and the work of WoMin. What's the relationship between myself and security and feminism? So let me start with the security angle. I mean, my early activism was around violence against women. So I worked at I was a volunteer at a counseling service in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it was extremely young when I started working on this and very traumatized by the extent and scale of violence against women. Then I've worked most of my life on the land and agrarian terrain. And so the focus on extractives really is an extension of that, given its impact on land and the environment and people living in rural areas. The question of risk and repression has been an ongoing theme throughout my life. So when I was working as an advisor to a movement of people called the Landless Peoples Movement, there was extreme repression against this movement by the South African state, which was feeling quite threatened by the demands of people on the ground for land redistribution. We have one of the most unequal land distributions in the world as a result of the apartheid system. And a number of people, including advisors in the movement, were attacked. Our communications were interfered with. We had false arrests, and a few of us had actually been tortured by a democratic state very early on in its life. And so even in the work we've been doing as WoMin, the question of risk and repression is a running theme. And as I've mentioned before, is deeply linked and experienced by women in violent ways. So you can see it's almost these two dimensions are a running thread throughout my life and my activism and my work, although I've never really understood them in a formal sense as security work. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Kristian.
Thank you, Samantha. Wonderful. And I think the audience can perceive the diversity of backgrounds and approaches with activists and scholars joining our session today from different parts of the world. Vamos ahora a iniciar entonces la presentación de los artículos.
Let's now start the presentation of the articles. Each one of you has enough knowledge for a single conference by each one of you. Today, the challenge is to ask you to summarize in 5 minutes the main points of the articles you have written for this monographic publication. So we will start with Nora Miralles. Nora, you describe the current security model and the criticisms you make from a feminist perspective. Please, could you share with us these criticisms? Well, above all, before speaking about the criticisms in themselves, I think it's important to talk about what the concept of what hegemonically is understood as security, especially because it is still seen by many people as something that's static, objective, and technical, and it goes beyond our knowledge and our understanding, and also our control, and therefore we can't approach it, criticize it, or act on it to transform it. Security, in fact, is a concept that's constantly being questioned and disputed. And that's why we need to use adjectives. And intimately, when we think about it, it has a lot of meaning. It talks to us about tranquility and the need to live fearlessly. It is very difficult, as Carme Magallon says, to turn this around and to reappropriate the concept of security, as these critical voices say, but at a time in which not only it has come back with very powerfully, but to the point that sometimes in which the early public policy in which states are ready to invest is security, it's important to analyze about this model. What do states talk about when they say we have to reduce our freedoms and liberties because the national security requires it? And well, those who criticize it have expanded the definition of security. Well, security is revisited as a common good. It's an ideal that's a fundamental vision of the compact with which the modern state is created, in which the national security is given in to a national authority. And this is key, not only in my article, but in general. It's an exemption of the care of public life. You delegate to the state the responsibility of our security. Before the 20th century in the West, the use of this concept was not specially extended in international politics, and not until the 40s, but especially during the Cold War, when security is associated in hegemonically to the decision-making power of states, in other words, to their capacity to discourage other states to attack them. And it's also associated to the threats of against states as a subject to any internal or external enemy that jeopardizes its sovereignty or its freedom. In the 90s, with the end of the Cold War and the liberal revaluation of the individual with individual interest, when we we start to see the architecture of human rights, and when some voices start breaking this state-centric vision, and they start thinking, okay, who decides on these policies, and why? What are the interests, which is not only technical and objective, but it's deeply political and subjective. And this subjectivity is key to say that what the state considers a threat against its security does not necessarily coincide with the dangers and risks that the citizens of those states face. So if we have to approach human dignity, the state should be displaced from the focus of security policies, and we should place that focus on communities and individuals. And this is what's proposed by the main paradigm that's critical with this hegemonic proposal of security, i.e. human security, which is included for the first time formally in a report about human development in 1994. A paradigm that proposes to look for security through human development and not through the weapons, to approach the deep causes of human insecurity and not only the consequences of it. Conflict, which, as Kristian have said, and out of that paradigm, we still use that paradigm to confront this militarist security, which after September 11 in New York has recovered very powerfully, as Carme Colomina says in her article, this militaristic vision of security, which has generated fear and it has marred with insecurity and powerlessness the, with the economic system and its crisis. And it has carried out an enormous cutback of rights with mass surveillance. Oftentimes, these policies have been carried out when other proposals were being defended about human security. And this, as the most critical vision say, this has been possible because the paradigm of human security has ended up being void of its content to make it more digestible, more functional, and more liberal, and therefore more distant from all of these criticisms to the socioeconomic structures that leave the colonial North-South domination, and which, as anti-colonial studies say. But one of the things we know about this impossibility of reaching human security without touching power structures, and the one that has questioned the most the role of state as a protector, are the feminist studies about security and feminism. the criticism made by feminism. Experiences of insecurity are not universal. They are not generalizable because they depend on categories like race, class, gender, and the capacities, the sexuality, or gender identity, which are not affected all equally. And this is a criticism of human security. The state not only affects as a the state does not always affect or act as a protector, but it generates and perpetuates inequalities because violences are not in silos, but they are contingent. And therefore, it's not enough to point out to the experiences of security and violence we suffer from feminism. Feminism tells us that we have to touch power structures, and what we propose is to stop delegating our security to the state and assume that absolute security does not exist. And what actually exists are violences that we need to combat, overcome, and the fear we feel, as Audrelon says, why should we be powerless? Well, it can also give us power to survive them on a daily basis. Fascinating, Nora. How have you summarized in 5 minutes a long article? Thank you. Anna, over to you.
In your article, you highlight the relevance of, or you remind us of the relevance of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, but what you do highlight is that it still suffers from several limitations. Could you briefly describe these to us, please?
Well, thank you, Kristian. And I feel lots of pressure to rush and do it in 5 minutes as well. I'll do my best for this. So just a quick reminder to the audience that, well, the resolution, this first resolution of the Women, Peace and Security agenda was unanimously adopted by the Security Council on October 31st in 2000. And it marked the first time that the Security Council addressed the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women. It made other contributions, but just like a very, very general introduction. So my starting point is the fact that the 1325 was indeed an exceptional resolution in many senses. And from my perspective, one of the most relevant of these senses is that it came to be thanks to the outstanding work of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, which encompassed several NGOs that not necessarily had the same approaches to the issues at the core of the resolution. That is very important to notice. And then, of course, we have to remember that the Security Council is the most powerful organ of the United Nations, and it's also the least democratic, very, very state-centered, and reflecting extremely unequal global power relations. So say economic, political, and military relations. So as a consequence, there are significant tensions that are continue to be negotiated through the implementation and through the subsequent resolutions that are part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And at the center of these tensions, I say, is what Cynthia Cockburn describes as the delicate language of security. Okay, so just gonna go quickly to the 5 tensions that I identify in my essay. And the first one is that first, the securitization of women, which was a really crude awakening of the realities of how was the resolution interpreted, this idea of protecting women. And as Dr. Parashar rightly points in her essay, it was not only used by the United States. I highlight the US because they are, 1 year before they voted for the resolution, right? And then it just happened that they just felt like protecting Muslim women, and the emphasis, this very colonial obsession is still going on there. And then this idea of the white women in the military as proof of the moral superiority of the West, right, over the other. Then the second point that I highlight is the relation with security, and in particular, military institutions. For example, NATO has its own 1325 action plan, which is very controversial, right? And they've been quite active in the implementation of the agenda. So something important to note is that the resolution does not literally mention the inclusion of more women in the military, but the language is a bit tricky there. And it has been noted by many feminists. And it says that we have to increase the presence of women in decision-making roles aimed at promoting peace and security. So that's when it gets really complicated, right? Some countries have taken an approach of just including more women in the militaries, which is the add women and steer, right? And then others have perhaps done a little bit more of work of questioning the gender premises upon which these institutions are built. But this is a very contentious point. The third tension that I highlight here is, what do you understand of security? If it's an external threat, then it means that it's something out there, right? And then this understanding then perpetuates North-South power dynamics, as Nora just mentioned. And to illustrate this, I quote very quickly the recent publication by Tony Hastrup and Jamie Hagen, where they found national action plans. They just maintain this idea that certain type of women are considered, the ones that we are going to go and rescue. They reside in the global south. And of course, this is not a new criticism. I see Dr. Parashar nodding. I remember her piece from the Oxford Handbook related to this issue. So what I argue is that this is not only problematic because it reflects, as we already mentioned, unequal still colonial power dynamics. It obscures the possible complicity and responsibility of the global north on these conflicts, but it also ignores the fact, and this is very important, that women within their own borders of these countries are perhaps being endangered by the state itself. And here I bring the case of Canada, which I think is very, very exemplary in this sense. They are a leader in WPS agenda, yet we have a very difficult situation with Indigenous women and girls. Another limitation, I think, is also this idea of what is understood of security in the global north and in the global south, right? And as Kristian pointed in the introduction, in Latin America, we have, sorry, that was my time, I'm rushing, okay. So in Latin America, it is considered normally a conflict-free region, right? Because we have not had like interstate wars. We've had some, but it's not perhaps relative in comparing with other regions in the world. It's still considered as sort of a peaceful region, perhaps leaving Colombia a little bit apart. But can we really speak of peace with the highest rates of violence in the world? I mean, and I give the examples of femicides, it's just one example, right? They are not considered international security problems, and they are located in, domestic politics, and domestic also in the sense of within the home, right? So it has nothing to do with anything any of the work of the Security Council. But then I also ask, are these rates of violence really that far off from international power dynamics? And I'd say they are not. And furthermore, I think these cases also put into question quite clearly the division between peace and conflict times is very problematic, right? And then we have to bring the concept of the continuum of violence. And this is especially felt really hard in the bodies of women. So the final point, okay, I'm closing, the current pandemic. I think it not only shows the limitation of the understanding of security within the 1325 and the broader agenda, but in general to the idea of security, right? I mean, what is the point of having trained and heavily armed soldiers to intervene in an event of international security threat if medical personnel lack the resources to save lives? And not only that, medical personnel also has a female face in most parts of the world due to prevailing stereotypes and precarious employment. Women are overrepresented in the care sector. And of course, it is impossible to ignore the rising rates of domestic violence. So just to close these ideas, perhaps I am painting a very grim picture of the resolution. I think it has its limitations, but I also would rescue that it's a pivot to to name the continuous persistence and adaptations of patriarchy. But there's also some evidence that they open up, not just this resolution, but the others, open spaces for the concept of insecurity to be redefined from a non-state perspective. So I think it's up for debate to see how flexible it is and how much we can perhaps remember that the real agenda of feminist peace is actually precedes and I think outlives the resolution itself. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Extremely thought-provoking reflections. Over to Swati now. The title of your article is Gendering War and War Bodies. Could you please introduce these thoughts to us and share them?
Yeah, thank you, Kristian. And thank you, Anna. Actually, I thought that you were echoing so much of my own thoughts there. And I've written another very critical piece on that. So we can have a chat later. Also, I noticed I'm a minority on the panel in some ways, the academic who's just kind of, doing academic research. All of you have so much more on the ground experience as journalists and activists. So fantastic. Okay, so I talk a little bit about gendering war and war bodies. It's obviously very vast topic. So what could I then capture? I start with the premise that we continue to live in a world where, of course, war is the larger reality and the single most studied activity in almost every scholarly discipline. I keep talking about disciplines because I am an academic. You see war being talked about in literary works, in popular culture, in literally every space. Some of us experience war through distance and discourses as we study its various aspects, but for many people across the world, it offers opportunities of various kinds and also brings a lot of suffering, as we know. Because living inside wars has become a reality. And by talking about living inside wars, I mean, going back to the point that Anna made, that there is a continuum between war and peace. We cannot think of them either as, as existing in a vacuum. There is war within peace and peace within war, and you don't enter into war and you don't exit out of war. Wars are very messy, and there are people living inside them. So to think of war a little bit as something that affects everyday life, war as politics of injury, as is something that is deeply gendered in terms of how it is imagined, how it is strategized, how it is performed. And also in its impact. If you think about representation of war, if you think about the language that we use to describe war, very recently on the pandemic, we started thinking and talking about the pandemic as if it was a war on the people and we had to, protect ourselves from an unknown enemy. And we started talking about, the vaccine in terms of weaponization of that medical space. So there's a lot of that language. And of course, storytelling, right? How we tell stories about war. And that, I think, is absolutely critical to the feminist work that we do. Femininity and masculinity are invoked in specific ways. And of course, we know that men and women perform a variety of roles. There is a lot of, gender hierarchy that is reflected when we think about wars. There is upholding of gender subordination. But also when we think about wars, for those of us who have studied it, and also I would argue lived inside it or lived with it, there's also the aspect of transformation of gender relations. Whether it's for good or bad is another debate, but a lot goes on in that gender space. Gendering war, I would argue, shifts the focus from war strategies and actor motivations to actually exploring how war privileges gender roles and hierarchies. And that's pretty much what I've studied for a very long time. We think about feminine values as something that is frowned upon or projected as those that need to be protected and cherished. And we talk about the bulk of the war labor being being undertaken by men. But as I say in the piece, that a gendered reading of war actually disrupts these narratives. It busts war myths and prevents this perpetuation of the idea of war as the natural outcome of conflicts in society. So then very quickly to sum up, what are some of the key feminist contributions that I highlight in this piece? First, that in the last 3 decades or so, feminists have written extensively about the need to democratize war studies and, center people in its analysis. If you read a lot of academic work, it's about actors, it's about motivations, causes, consequences. We talked very little about people. And I think that's the shift that feminists brought to it and started talking about how war impacts women, their experiences as victims, survivors, anti-war activists, cultural national symbols on whose bodies wars are waged. So that shift happened with feminist research, right? Thanks to feminist research, and this is my second point, that we have known about the magnitude of sexual violence in wars. And I think none of you here in this audience are new to this vast literature and activism around war-related sexual violence. Emasculating the enemy and impregnating enemy women is now, as we know, has been a war strategy, but it took feminists to uncover that. And we are this year in 2021 celebrating or marking the 50th year aware of the Liberation War of Bangladesh that happened in 1971, in which we estimate that anything between 200 to 300,000 women were subjected to sexual violence. So we're kind of reliving that, and it took a lot of good feminist work to highlight that in different parts of the world. Comparatively less on sexual violence is written about sexual violence experienced by men and boys. But again, it took feminists to point that out. And these experiences are underreported precisely because of the gendered order that thrives on preserving militarized masculinity and not on narratives of emasculation. So obviously the concern that, if men tell stories of experiencing sexual violence, and of course, through that processes of emasculation and all of that, all those narratives will mess up the gendered space. I mean, that there has been very little space for that. And I think feminists have highlighted that in very profound ways. The third important thing that feminist work has pointed out is the idea of children being involved in war, inducted into armed militias, as sex slaves. This issue of children in the international space, in international relations and security studies is only now getting a lot of attention. For a very long time, we didn't think of children as actors in the international system, whereas so many armies and militias are actually made of children, and children are victimized. So that's something to think through. The fourth point that I make is how much feminists have contributed to moving the war narrative from thinking about, women as the war bringing suffering to women and children, to moving beyond these narratives of victimhood to actually point out how women are involved as actors, as combatants, as perpetrators of violence, how they are frontline fighters, and how they make decisions as heads of states, as part of militias, guerrilla groups. And I think some of this has also been reflected in, now liberal states, for example. There's a lot of debate about whether women should be inducted into the military or not. And I think it took feminists to bring this idea through. I'm not saying that everything is resolved here, that feminists are all very comfortable that all women should just join the military. But I think that debate at least has been revived, and with all its nuances, it's something that feminists have contributed to. Rather than dismiss these as, women fighters, as cases of women performing militarized masculinity, feminist works actually highlight the prevalence of militarized masculinities, which may perform tasks that are seemingly patriarchal, but with different motivations and perspectives. So that's something to think through. And then the next point is about how, while mainstream analysis continues to focus on actors, decisions, methods, outcomes of war, feminists have brought also the concept of everyday. What is it? I have studied a number of wars in South Asia, and it's also interviewed combatants, people inside wars living there. How do they negotiate everyday life? And I think that reveals a completely different story of agency, of survival, of how they work for peace and those situations of precarity. And I think that's a great contribution. And final point that I make is of masculinity, how important the concept of masculinity has enriched our understanding of militarization, and how militarization and masculinity are co-constitutive. Here I offer two quick critiques. One is that feminists have also overemphasized certain kinds of war violence, right? So you see a lot of work on sexual violence, rape, direct combat, disappearances. There's been a lot of talk of that. But we have ignored certain other kinds of violence, which to me is absolutely critical. For example, hunger, mass deaths occurring due to hunger, mass starvation deaths, or famines which come out of wars, or which may not come out of war, but it unleashes suffering. I think, Kristian, you said in your introduction that more deaths have occurred outside wars. And I think that's something that I feel that feminists have also kind of not grasped fully. So in conclusion, the gendered stories of war point to varying roles that men and women perform, the embeddedness and subversion of gender hierarchies, and the preservation of the gendered social order, where wars appear to be inevitable and perhaps natural. So feminists have ably demonstrated through their research and activism that wars are normalized through gendered discourses and practices. There needn't be wars, but we kind of create wars through discursive practices as well. However, this reimagination would also require us to acknowledge differences in feminist approaches, epistemologies, and methods, enabling us to bust every possible myth that normalizes war in human history or privileges one kind of suffering over another. And there's a lot to say here, but let me stop this here. And thank you again, Kristian.
No, thank you, Swati. Again, fascinating amount of information, thought-provoking, and very condensed. I think all of your presentations are, I hope, an appetizer for everybody listening to us to go to the website and download the articles and really read them, and hopefully also engage with the authors subsequently. Carmen, te pasamos la palabra a ti.
Carmen, now the floor is yours. You suggest that the EU has developed a false narrative about security. Please shed some light on that statement. Well, that has been pointed out. I focused my analysis on Europe because that's the region I know best professionally, and I explained how in recent times, especially in the last 2 decades, Europe has built up a security narrative through the militarization of crisis. And Nora Miralles pointed it out, and Swati Parashar as well. The more vulnerable this EU feels, the more it uses symbolic policies and war language, with soldiers out in the street after the terror attacks, or as Swati has just said, with President Emmanuel Macron in March declaring war, literally declaring health war to coronavirus, or even the Spanish government the first week when they had a press conference, we had generals and military people to talk about the governmental action against coronavirus. So Europe has created a false security discourse through the preeminence of the war language and the military power. We have seen how governments and how political movements have used perceived or real threats to stigmatize alterities. So, for example, they have used a concept of security that has been based on borderlines. They go against the life of those who want to come to the EU's territory. So these are securities that have been built up against people and state powers that act with the excuse of security or on behalf of security in the name of security against the people who question it. And the pandemic has filled us with examples of this trend. We have seen how governmental responses against the pandemic have been used oftentimes to concentrate power and to have authoritarian measures in state of alarm and to legitimize police violence in the repression of protests and demonstrations in different EU countries. An alarming number of governments, and that has been denounced by many civil organizations, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, they've used the health crisis as an excuse to restrict the free flow of information and to reduce the number of media critical against governments. So the securitization of Europe is actually violating rights. I was talking about refugees beforehand, but not only refugees, there is a clear going back. And here I include also women's rights. We have seen how in the last few years, gender has become a field of ideological confrontation in Europe. In fact, it is a commonplace if that's used by the extreme right wing, and the extreme right wing has many different faces within the EU, but it's the contestation of the right of women, and it's a cross-sectional argument used by right-wing organization. Many administrations want to turn them invisible. Public spaces are very masculine. And this is a structural discrimination. Daniel in a rarity calls it mutilated democracies. These are democracies that are led by the logic or the rationale of sovereignty and a concept of sovereignty that has so many practical applications like the concept of security and not for reasons of human interdependency, which is what constitutes our societies. Therefore, European governments need to recognize these links amongst people, amongst all of these structures of violence that exist in these patriarchal societies in terms of precariousness, violence, economic insecurity, invisibility, mutilation, which marks these enormous internal differences, the enormous inequalities that exist within the EU. And to all of this, well, I'm not going to dwell on it too much because everybody has mentioned it already. How the health emergency has been used as a cover to push the agenda even further, to push some very specific political agendas further. We have seen how the pandemic has been used as an excuse, and we will have to see how we go about dismantling all of these knots once we overcome the pandemic. We talk about a new technocratic government in Italy, not a democratic, a technocratic government in Italy, as happened during the financial meltdown in 2008. So the article, my article, expresses some words by Jean-Paul Lederer when he opened the University of Peace in Sant Cugat here in Catalonia in 2018. He said human security is not dependent on the amount or the size of weapons, but on the quality of our relationships, on the creativity and the imagination and the courage to act based on our convictions and our ideas and our values. And I think it's very interesting to have this definition of security based on care and protection, but understood as a relational power and not as a partial power, which is what they try to impose on us. We have to overcome these hegemonic visions of the concept of security, and it's very hard to doing so when we are faced with governments that keep on using the old concept of sovereignty, boundary, influence spaces, when the world is more interconnected than ever, when these relations are more varied than ever, when there is a cross-sectionality. And we see this, for example, the cross-sectionality in the protests, how that space of protest, these uneasiness, this discomfort has transcended lockdowns in very different countries during the pandemic. So I believe that this awareness about the need to change is still very much present. And actually contesting this abuse of power is still present globally, even though now it's a bit, it has been weakened because of the lockdown. And that's because there is too slow an evolution of these institutional frameworks. And that's why we see these background evolutions. But these are the ones that should not predominate. The change is overly slowly for us, but there is a clear confrontation between the agendas and the discourses at the moment right now. I'm going to stop here. Thank you, Carme. Wonderful. The EU loves to look at itself as the great protector of human rights, and you have just exposed a criticism that's very much, very well substantiated.
Now over to Samantha Hargreaves. You have produced a collective article actually with WoMin and your colleague Shamin Me, where you introduce two arguments that are the pillars of your ecofeminist perspective. On the one hand, the relationship between domination of nature and domination of women, and on the other hand, that security can't be guaranteed under the framework of a capitalist and extractivist system. Please enlighten us with your...
Okay, thanks very much. I've been listening so closely to the prior inputs and I'm absolutely fascinated. I've never worked on security. I certainly haven't thought much about it. So I'm trying to figure out the links between the prior inputs and this one now. And I think I mean, what comes to mind very much is that there's actually a war, and it's not peculiar to Africa. It happens wherever there's the extraction of natural resources, whether that's industrial forestry, industrial agriculture, industrial fishing, mining, oil and gas extraction. Those are all the different forms of extractives. But really in these rural communities where extraction is happening, large-scale extraction of natural resources is happening, there really is a silent and invisible war being perpetrated against communities and women in particular. So maybe just to give a little bit of background to the paper, I mean, we've been working on violence for some years now. And we've been really trying to theorize it from a very different perspective and understand what we're seeing and hearing. So from the outset of WoMin's work, we came across examples and testimony from across the region about increased interpersonal violence, and particularly violence against women. People loosely referred to there was more conflict between men, there was more domestic violence, there was increased rape. So in very, very general terms, people talked about increased violence against women. But there was one dimension of this violence that we saw and was reported on, was the particular form of violence which is linked to the repression of communities saying no to large-scale natural resource extraction, or when they're undermining the terms of dispossession dictated by the states and corporations, such as artisanal miners who are removed from their allotments and their very livelihoods are absolutely destroyed. So to focus on a couple of things. Firstly, what violence are we actually talking about? So the violence, it could include assaults, false charges, abductions, killings. There have been many murders of activists across the world that are fighting resource extraction. And in the particular case of women, we saw sexual harassment, sex for food or water, rape and gang rape, and obviously murder of women as well. Now, the traditional human rights defender organizations talk about human rights defenders being targeted by the state and corporations. But in fact, our experience across the region is that the violence is targeted at all people in the community. Certainly, leaders are often singled out, but it is communities and women as a whole that are violated in different ways. And like a couple of the speakers mentioned before, this violence is invisible until feminists start working on it. So if you look at the literature around extractives and conflict on the region, aside from work that is being done by feminists or organizations like ourselves that are feminist in orientation, this violence is against women specifically is largely invisible. The second point is who is perpetrating the violence. So I guess like other situations where security is undermined, it's soldiers, police, and private security. So you can see the arms of the state are very present in this repression. And so this work was very important for us because it started to draw out the relationship between extractivist capitalism, militarization, and violence against women. And it revealed the role of the state. The state was not an independent, neutral body. The state was complicit. The state was enabling the extractivist corporations. This is evidenced in other ways around extraction. So you'll find the state fails to implement laws and safeguards, or relaxes laws on taxation, or not acting on environmental pollution, and many, many more ways in which the state is complicit. What is the purpose of the violence? This is a third point I wanted to address and is also in the paper. Our analysis is that this violence is cultivating a climate of absolute fear in communities. It's keeping women and communities compliant and abiding with the terms of dispossession imposed on them. It's ensuring there's no interference with the accumulation of profits by corporations and the political elite. So that's really the purpose of this violence in all of its forms. The fourth dimension that we have really built up over years is our analysis that extractivist capitalism is violent. Its essence is violence against workers, against communities who are dispossessed, whose land and resources are polluted. It is violent against women, as we've all discussed already. it's violent against nature. I mean, the process of extracting natural resources is deeply violent on ecologies, on forests, on the land, stripping the land. And ultimately, we argue that it's violent on the planet, given the contribution of extractivism to the climate and ecological crisis that we're sitting with. Again, that crisis is linked to the COVID crisis as well. So our position is very clearly that this system and the role of states and the violence that is perpetrated against people and women specifically, we can't reform this. We can't mitigate it. Ultimately, we have to destroy it. Our fifth position, and this really comes from our ecofeminist perspective, which has been a growing perspective of the life of women. Ecofeminists look at nature, so ecology, and they place feminism together. So we examine the relationship between nature and humanity. And very importantly, an ecofeminist socialist analysis will tell you that under capitalism, nature is reduced to an object to be exploited for profit. The same is true of human beings and their labor, whether that's paid or unpaid. Capitalism is an economy of unpaid costs. Costs to women and their labor, to peasants and indigenous people that rely on resources, to ecosystems that are required to absorb the costs of production, which is pollution. The costs are dirty. We see the destruction of natural forests, the pollution of air and water bodies, the loss of land and livelihoods, and much more. And because capitalism, science, industrialization has imposed on us the notion that humanity and nature are separate. But in our analysis, if we start to examine the relationship between humanity and nature around extractivism, we see that they are totally interrelated and mutually dependent. So the pollution and destruction of nature are repeated in humanity. People become ill with cancers. People suffer respiratory health problems. Women have gynecological problems arising from the pollution that accompanies extractivism. And working class and peasant women carry the greatest burden because of their work in nature, harvesting from forests, caring for water bodies, producing and processing household food, caring for the family. So they are at the front line of all of these costs, which are violent, and they carry these costs in their bodies, hearts, and souls. Coming to solutions, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but for us, it's been very clear because we have this very in-depth understanding of the relationship of capital and state. We believe quite strongly that we cannot rely on those who perpetrate the violence, the state, to uphold the rights of women. So we're very clear we cannot ask the state, which is deeply implicated in the entree of capital and supports the exploitation of nature and workers. We cannot ask the same state to relieve people of the insecurity and the violence they're facing, because the state is the reason, one of the core reasons why this violence has been perpetrated. The state is highly patriarchal and racist. So we cannot ask the state to protect women, and Black women in particular, because the state regulates and upholds discrimination and violence. And so the response of mainstream violence against women organizations are lacking, for the state is the primary target for reform in their perspective. I'll talk a little bit more, I know my time is up, but talk a little bit more around how we see some of the very necessary responses that are needed around this extreme insecurity and violence that communities and women confront.
Thank you, Samantha, to bring this additional perspective. And I think it's quite clear from the 5 presentations how they are completely complementary to each other and actually speak to each other. I think we all would love to have time now to have more interaction between yourself, but I'm afraid in this presentation that won't be possible. Entramos en la tercera ronda.
So now we will start with the third and last round, which will be shorter, this time to respond to a specific question that I asked you. And somehow it is a question asked by Ruth in the chat. She asks, how do we go from narrative to practice? And could you answer this question as soon as possible, or as shortly as possible? Or have I written down the question? Let me look. which would be the key element. There would be more than one, of course, but let's focus on just one key element that would be necessary to transform the current paradigm, the current security paradigm. To answer this question, we will follow the same order. So I'm going to give the floor to Nora to start. Nora, you have the floor.
Supongo que en realidad debería decir que lo que
Well,
realmente es necesario.
I guess that what I would need to say, but what we need to change this hegemonic paradigm is a correlation of powers that invites us internationally and nationally to adopt human security policies. Finally, human security policies in the widest sense of the term. That includes as an end the transformation of all of these structures of violence and the predatory structures against nature, against life, and against everybody. And as immediate proposals to defend issues like disarmament, even small weapons, which in gender terms has an equivalent importance to the trade of large weapons in large conflicts. For example, a reduction of military contingents and military expenses. Proposals that could be called feminist external policies, even though, well, this proposal is kidnapped by a liberal vision of feminism. But as a daily, practical, and powerful concept, I use mutual responsibility concept at the time in which states have renounced to protecting citizens beyond the law, and they have opted or they have chosen privatizations about the rights of migrants, women, LGBTI people, or political rights. They have reinforced the structures that generate inequalities and oppression. Maybe we should break up this individual compact with the state and start to become responsible for each other. And that doesn't mean patrolling the street, as some people think, but to break the barrier between what's individual and what's collective, as suggested by Latin American anti-colonial feminisms, and to see each other as vulnerable and interdependent, but also to break away with what we understand as care, this free care by women, to take them out of the private sphere, to politicize them and to turn them into something responsible. That's the community's responsibility, not, so that young people in the neighborhood have a future, so that they do not replicate the violence, and to avoid the structural causes that cause this violence. And of course, that implies to apply to all of the fields of life, this the ethics from the feminists, to stop thinking of ourselves as isolated individuals and to build up the societal fabric. Thank you, Nora. Okay, I'm going to read out some of the questions that are being sent by the audience because they complement this question I asked you. Heidi Tourme from Uruguay has just written. She's an MP and a mistress. I'm worried about the loss of rights that have already been conquered. What's the best strategy to deconstruct the patriarchal ideology? She asks. Okay, I'm going to ask other questions between your different answers. So now the floor is for Ana Velasco.
Okay, thank you, Kristian. Okay, so just I was ready to answer, and then I don't know if I should answer the other question now, or should I try to mix them a little bit?
Please choose.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna go
or merge the answers because the questions are kind of related.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna do my. Okay, I'll try to answer both. So I think when I first read the question, I just thought the same as just Samantha mentioned. We have to destroy the system, but then I said, okay, we have to provide a more specific answer. And then I said, okay, I think as feminists, and of course there are other answers to this, my own reflection would be, I think we should reflect and invest greater efforts in perhaps dramatically deconstructing the concept of security every time we use it. I think as feminists, I'd say that it's a pivotal responsibility that we must uphold. On security, we have to make sure that it remains as a contested issue. And I think that is partly opening the way to answer the second question. And I think that by doing so, perhaps we have to embrace the spirit of the killjoy spirit, as Sarah Ahmed suggests, the will to get into trouble, to enact the world we're aiming for. And for instance, I mean, we know that as feminists, a lot of work has been done in dissecting the so-called nation, right? And in these times, that is, I think, particularly critical, especially with the rise of the far right again, which is becoming mainstream again. So I think we have to be very critical of the concept of national security. And that's just one layer, but I think there are others. So as, for example, Angela Davis also states, the feminist analysis might not necessarily foreground women or even gender as the main category of analysis. So then we have to break it down constantly and question the overlapping power structures that are the sources of these ongoing inequalities and these categories of oppression. And some of them were already highlighted by other authors in this edition. And I think we also have to constantly revise our own assumptions and our own positionality in how, when, and to whom we speak of security. And I'd say this reflection is very relevant. Let's just start as taking care of ourselves as perhaps researchers or journalists. And a topic that's non-spoken in the security field is perhaps self-care, engaging with trauma-informed literature and techniques. And by this referred to supporting healing in a way that does not further harm. It's not that easy, and it's something that we don't really discuss as much as I think we should, right? And also, of course, and as Nora just mentioned, I think it's also informing our research ethics, like being careful on maintaining an unequivocal focus on the structures of power rather than on the people, which means to resist the urge sorry, my English gets really clumsy when I'm tired. Resist the urge to study people and their social problems, and just choosing to write instead of power in the form of institutions, policy, and research itself, right? So I'd say that just to summarize this, from my perspective, I think studying or thinking about the intersection of feminism and security is not only about adding a layer or case studies to the mainstream understandings of security, but to challenge the ontological assumptions around the concepts. I think that is our greatest task.
Thank you so much, Anna. I hope the panelists are also able to see the questions and comments we receive. I'm afraid we won't be able to read them all because we need to wrap up, actually finish in some 10-15 minutes. What I would invite, I know it's difficult to juggle, Anna was trying her best now and I think she did great, is you can either choose to answer my initial question, or if there's anyone you're picking up from the audience that's directed to you, or you think helps you make an additional key point you want to make, please feel free to pick and choose and decide by yourself. Swati, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Kristian. I think there are some great questions that I've just read through, but also I think they speak to each other in some ways and also relate to what you ask us about how we are going to push the boundaries in some ways to think about new paradigms. But before that, I think somebody was talking about this sense of anxiety at the loss of lives. And I think, everywhere we are doing the body counts, unfortunately, in this age of COVID. I think one key aspect is that as feminists, we are also invested in issues of justice. And I think that we often forget that there has to be restorative and reparative justice, which we are all fighting for in Samantha, in your area, and in your area. And all of us in our own fields are very invested in that idea. So I just want to emphasize that we don't lose hope because there's a long fight of justice involved. There was another quick question on discourse and practice, like do feminists make a difference on the ground? And I really kind of of like that, because I want to re-emphasize that when you do feminist work, you are on the ground. You don't remain this ivory tower academic. I know I'm a minority here, but the work that I do speaks to a lot of work that Carme or Anna or Samantha are doing. Like, we're speaking to each other. I didn't see any dissonance in the panel in terms of our beliefs and work that we do. So I think you do work, and a lot of feminist work, good work, has informed policymakers, has informed, for example, in my own field of war, sexual violence, it was feminist research that was responsible for providing data to several war crimes tribunals that were investigating crimes against women. So don't take this lightly. It's a lot of serious work, feminists on the front line putting a lot at risk to bring to us this very rich data, very rich knowledge that we need. With this, I want to jump to that question about other kinds of violence, right? Like symbolic material, the violence of poverty. And I don't want to really get into the debate about Galtung and talk about structural violence. I just want to leave that aside. There's been continuously in various societies, there's been talk of how violence cascades and violence one violence speaks to another. But I think the larger question, and this is my critique also of feminist security studies, which I think has built itself into a canon. And I think we need to resist that idea that, this is, the moment we say feminist security studies, to me, it's always what is inside it, what is outside it. I think when we build these disciplinary canons, it's very problematic. And I think we really need to expand notions of violence, right? So seeing security and insecurity, if you look at it from a particular disciplinary lens or from policy perspectives, it becomes very limited. And there are other forms of violence and erasures that we just don't notice. For example, we don't see, I was doing work on famines, and I've been studying that for a while now, hunger deaths, mass hunger. And it struck me that while all of us talk about, the Holocaust and the 6 million, the deaths, the war, we don't talk about the 3 million who died in the Bengal famine. We don't talk about over 20 million people who died, during the colonial period through different acts of, famines and starvation deaths. The Bengal famine was such a severe account of what happened, with colonial government playing its own role, right? So famines, for example, don't occur because there is shortage of food. They occur because somebody in power makes the decision to starve certain people who's, you go into the politics of whose body deserves to be saved. This is exactly what played out in the Bengal famine, with food being diverted, grains being diverted to warring, Britain. All the food that grew in India, because India was a colonized state. So I just want us to rethink the many different ways in which we are erasing other kinds of violence, because we are hyper-visibilizing certain other kinds of violence. And I think we have done a lot of research on sexual violence and wars, for example, without thinking through the consequences of what that hypervisibility does to erasures and to other kinds of violence that we could be thinking through very carefully. So I think the paradigm shift has to be thinking about violence differently, to thinking about deaths in non-conflict areas, to think about violence that occurs outside wars, violence that is related to war, and to not sort of erase it out of any analysis of contemporary political, because violence, let me conclude by this, violence is not a product. It is a process in many, many societies where the violent histories of colonialism, for example, is still plays out in contemporary life, in post-colonial times, even in efforts of decolonization. Violence stays, it's a process. And I think we need to stay with that idea and look for violence in places where we have sort of, decided that this is not a topic that I'm interested in. I just want to end with this, that we are we are in the midst of preparing for a special issue on our famine project. And it's been interesting to pitch this to international relations and politics journals. No interest. They are like, okay, why don't you approach development people? Why don't you talk to disaster studies? We don't do hunger deaths, right? So just to give you a flavor of what's going on, and I think we have some serious rethinking to do. Thanks, Kristian.
Thank you, Swati. Para la información de la gente que nos está siguiendo,
For those of you who are following us, maybe you can't see all of the questions that are being asked. The panel members can actually see those questions in the chat, so you can be assured they are being read, and they will try and answer them as much as possible. At any rate, we can also tell you that there will be a report about this meeting with the names of people who have asked questions and the questions that have been asked as far as possible. All of this just to tell you that they will not fall into an empty drawer. They will not be falling into the void. But of course, we have only 5 minutes left. So now Carme has the floor. Thank you. I'm going to be very brief because I agree fully with what has been said so far. I fully share the analysis that has been made. To me, it's very hard to change the security paradigm without changing the concept of power and the concept of threat. To me, at the end of the day, all of it is closely intertwined. What are the existential threats that are actually jeopardizing our security? The main threats are not war threats. And this makes us change our concept of security. If what we're concerned about are not armies, but inequalities, invisibility, violence, and the exploitation of natural resources, as Samantha has explained very clearly, and other types of violence. To me, everything is closely intertwined. I would like to imagine, it's very hard for me to imagine a paradigm change without imagining all of this. And powers are fully fragmented nowadays and they're diffused. So who exercises power nowadays? We need to leave this binary rationale. And there was a question about this, and we were following this question by Alvaro Roda, who says, feminist security, would that improve the conflict? Well, I don't know whether he's being thought-provoking to my panel members, but we had a discussion with some colleagues at ICIP whether we had to talk about feminist security or about gender security and not feminist security. That was a debate we had at ICIP. To me, I don't know whether feminist security would improve or not the concept of security, but just to start, what I would say is that we would have evolved in this paradigm in approaching the context of violence. Who do we consider a victim? What do we consider violence? I believe that to start, what I would assure is that we would be changing our approach to conflicts and the idea of security and the idea of threat. To me, that would be the basic starting point. Wonderful, Carme. Samantha, over to you.
Great. So I'm not going to repeat points made, but I think we need to be very clear about the problem around violence and insecurity and repression and what needs to change. So we must hold that the system must be destroyed. And as we move towards this, we must engage strategically and tactically. So WoMin is very clear. We want the system that we describe as extractivist, patriarchal, racist capitalism, it needs to be destroyed. But we realize this is something we're not going to see in our lifetime. So we're very clear that we must make reforms, but they have to be strategic reforms that take us to the place we want to be. As a feminist activist, as somebody who's worked in movements, I think what is critical is building solutions from below. So from the very people that are carrying the costs of the system. So first, it's absolutely critical, no matter where we find ourselves, that we're strengthening people power and women's power in particular from the ground up. Secondly, it's really important that we stand in defense and in solidarity with communities that are saying no to these projects that are destroying life, destroying the environment, destroying nature. These are critical forms of violence. The third point, we need to support their defense of livelihoods and ways of being. So when you look at the ways in which people live in communities with nature, if you look at the ways in which people conserve resources, the ways in which people relate to one another, these are critical for the defense of nature and the planet as a whole. The fourth point, people in the global north, and we've talked about the north-south division, but you have a critical role to play. And I think the whole notion of is the global north and the global south, I think it's much more complex than that. But we need to see global north, people that are middle class, that are not living with the strife and the difficulties that the people I'm describing are. Is that you have to be blockading investments, standing in solidarity with people and their right to say no. And finally, again, this is a north-south question, settling the debt. There's a sovereign debt, there's a slavery debt, and a colonial debt, a climate and ecological debt, and that debt is owed from the traditional global north to the south. And it needs to not just be states, but movement to movement and people to people. So these are some of the responses that I see as absolutely essential if we're going to navigate our way out of this particular set of crises we're sitting with now.
Thank you, Samantha. Con esta intervención, me temo que
So
tendremos...
with Samantha's words, I'm afraid we have to call it a day. 1.5 hours have elapsed. Let me replicate what different people have said, different participating people have said. We have heard fascinating presentations, and I'd like to invite all of you to download the document and to disseminate it. Unfortunately, Patrick has disappeared now. I don't know you, but I can't see him anymore. We have lost Patrick. Oh, now he's back. They have contributed to this publication, and also the diversity of the people have followed us. Academics, activists, a Ministry of Home Affairs, a United Nations ambassador, a member of the Security Council. I mean, we have achieved what we wanted, a diversity of voices in order to have enough power to change unfair power relations. That is what our effort is invested in jointly. So thank you very much indeed, especially the authors, for having written for this review and for having participated in this presentation. And thank you all for having been with us. And we will keep on working following this same line. Thank you very much on behalf of ICIP. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank
It's been a
you.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Un placer. Bye bye. Thank
Nice
you,
meeting
everyone.
everyone.
Adiós,
Yeah.
adiós.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Are we not live anymore? ¿Ya estamos?